Hi, my name is Gáspár Nagy, and this is a SpecSync for MTM demo. In this video, I will demonstrate how you can execute your scenarios on Azure virtual machines. Let's get started. For this demonstration, I have created a simple SpecFlow project which has been already synchronized to TFS. This is a basic calculator example, and if you would like to know how this initial synchronization with TFS has to be done and generally how SpecSync works, please check out my other video or check the SpecSync documentation. As the scenarios have been synchronized already, you can see that there are special test case tags attached to the scenario, which is basically providing the linking from the scenario to the created test case. So let's go to the TFS portal. In my case, this is a Visual Studio Team System project, and let's see how the scenarios or how the test cases look like there. As you can see, right now you can see all the three test cases that were synchronized from my scenarios, and if you just open one of them, then you can see that basically the title, the different steps have been synchronized based on the scenario. What you can also see is that this test case is synchronized as automated test case. Automated test case means that this test case knows where to find that method that contains the automation for this particular test case. In our case, this means that it remembers which assembly this scenario was included and which was the test method that was generated by SpecFlow that is providing the automation for this particular scenario. This information can be used by different TFS infrastructures to be able to execute this test case automatically. Of course, for executing this test case, you also need a compiled assembly, you also need a build result of your project. So let's try to use this infrastructure and execute these test cases synchronized from scenarios on an Azure virtual machine. We could run it also in an average machine as well, but just for this demonstration, let's use Azure VMs for that. Before I go into the details how this can be done, let's have an overview of what we are going to implement now. Our plan is that we are configuring a special build, I call it lab build now, which will build the solution, copy the results or the compiled assemblies to Azure VMs, and execute the test cases on that Azure VMs itself. Once this has been done, the result can be published, so we can see a nice report on the TFS web interface. To be able to do that, we need to have some preparation. First of all, we have to prepare the virtual machines that we want to use for running these tests. On one hand, this means that you have to make a virtual machine that is able to execute, able to automate your test. This means that, for example, if you run a web UI test and you want to run it with Firefox, then you have to create a virtual machine which has Firefox installed. On the other hand, for the infrastructure that we will use, we need a special configuration for these VMs, which is called WinRM or Remote PowerShell. This is basically helping the infrastructure to be able to communicate with the virtual machine in a secure way. The configuration of this WinRM basically depends on how you have created this virtual machine. Basically, there are three options that we have to consider. If you have created or if you are creating your virtual machine in the classic Azure mode, then the WinRM is configured by default. On the other hand, it's much more useful to use the new resource manager infrastructure because then you can collect all the resources related to the virtual machine together and manage them together. So if you are creating a resource manager based VM, then WinRM is not configured by default. There are two options to solve that. One is that you are using a special template which is already containing the necessary configuration for WinRM, or if you already have the VM or you just created one from the gallery, then you have to configure the WinRM manually. In both cases, the detailed description and the scripts that are necessary for doing this configuration can be found in the blog entry that is linked from this page. Since WinRM provides a secure connection, basically this means that we have to create a self-signed certificate. Self-signed certificates cannot be used in production, but we are using this VM for testing, so that's fine. For our demonstration, I have created a new resource group called SpecSync Lab, and as you can see, there are multiple elements in this SpecSync Lab, including a virtual machine called SpecSync Lab 1. And this virtual machine is hopefully running, so actually everything is prepared for running the tests on that. We have seen so far the necessary preparation for the virtual machine. we also have to have a little bit of preparation on the SpecFlow project side. On one hand, there is a restriction that this infrastructure basically only works for MS test based test automation. So basically, to be able to run the tests this way, SpecFlow has to be configured to use MS test. It's also enough if your project is using the SpecFlow Plus runner, because in this case, SpecSync can create an additional set of MS test based test automation, basically wrapping the SpecFlow Plus runner tests, so that you can also use it for this scenario. But for the sake of simplicity, let's just stick to MS test for now. The other specialty of this infrastructure that we will use is related to scenario outlines. Scenario outlines basically representing multiple tests in one form. So the scenario outline itself is just a template of the test, and in the example section we have the different examples, so in this case the 3 individual tests that has to be run. You can see the same in the synchronized test case from this scenario outline. Basically, we have one single test case for this scenario outline, which is a so-called parameterized test case, and in the parameter table you can see the individual test cases similarly to the example section in the feature file. The problem is that the infrastructure that we will use currently doesn't support such parameterized test cases. So in order to be able to run even scenario outlines on this virtual machine, we have to use a special trick. The special trick is provided by SpecSync. What SpecSync can do, that it basically can just create a wrapper method for this scenario outline, and this wrapper method basically will go through in a sequence all the examples that you have specified in the scenario outline and run them individually. So basically at the end we will have one single method which will run all 3 cases of the scenario outline. To be able to generate this special wrapper, you need to configure the SpecSync SpecFlow plugin. This can be done in the app.config file. The app.config file contains the SpecFlow configuration section, including the SpecSync plugin configuration. This configuration that you see here is already configured for the special wrapper, which is basically done with this parameters equals merged examples section. So to be able to run our tests on virtual machines, we have to have this special setting in there. As this has been already done, we just need to make sure that everything is fine, that our project compiles. That's fine. And we can also make sure that our scenarios are synchronized with TFS. My TFS synchronization settings have been placed into the CMD file, so I don't have to specify it again and again. If you want to see how this works, you have to check out the other video that I have published. So right now, just to be able to rerun the synchronization, we just need to rerun the CMD file. Everything looks good. It's also very important, since we will create a build that will compile the version of your project which are stored in TFS, that all changes that we have done are already published or pushed to the TFS source control. In our case now, we can see it from the Visual Studio status bar that everything is published, so we are really good to go. As we said, we wanted to create a special build, which I call lab build or lab test now, that will do this compilation and execution on the virtual machines. I have already created this build, so let's just have a review on that, how this can be done. The build contains a couple of steps, so let's just go through them and let's see how these can support our goal in our case. So the build starts in the usual way, so it just gets the sources, does a NuGet restore, it builds the solution, copies the files to some special artifacts directory or artifact staging directory. So far this is just like a normal build. After the build has been done, we use a special task which is called Azure VM file copy, which is, as the name says, it just copies some file to an Azure VM. In the configuration, we basically provided that we want to copy everything which is this artifact staging directory to some special Azure VM, which is configured by the following settings. So first of all, I had to select which kind of Azure infrastructure I would like to use. In this case, this is a resource manager based VM. I had to specify the subscription that I would like to use to make the connection, make the file copy. Then we have to decide what kind of target type this copy should have. In our case, we want to copy to virtual machines. We have to provide the storage account which is related to this virtual machine. Basically, this file copy task works in a way that it first copies it to the Azure storage, and then it distributes it to multiple virtual machines. So that's why the storage account is important. We also need to select the resource group, obviously, but then the interesting stuff comes. So this task can copy the files to multiple virtual machines, and there are multiple options how you can select the virtual machines that you would like to use. In my case, now I have selected machine names, but I didn't provide any filter criteria. So basically this means that I would copy these files to all of the virtual machines within this resource group. Currently I already have one virtual machine there, so this will copy it to that one. You have to provide the credentials that are used for copying the files. And the other important thing is that you have to provide the target folder on the virtual machines where the files will be located. So in my case, I basically wanted to copy them to the C/deployment, which you can specify it in this way. So basically I was just referring to the system drive environment variable, which is the C, and just used the deployment after that. So basically this will copy to the C/deployment folder onto the virtual machine. Let's remember that. Once all the compiled binaries are copied to the virtual machine, we have to do the next thing. So we have to run the tests on that virtual machine. Basically, running the tests on the virtual machine requires two tasks to be used. The first is this deploy test agent task. The deploy test agent task is basically copying all the necessary infrastructure, a test runner that is necessary to run the test there. So basically this is just preparing the test execution environment on that virtual machine. To be able to configure that, I had to specify the machine name in the machines box. Currently I have only one machine, but I could list also multiple machine names there. I had to provide the credentials, and I had to provide other options as well. The important thing is that you are selecting HTTPS in this case, and don't forget to check the test certificate option here. Otherwise, the deployment will fail because of the self-signed certificate that we are using in this virtual machine. Even though the task says that this is deploying the test agent, but it's not only deploying, it's also executing the test agent. So even if you have deployed it already, you have to still include this task into the build. Otherwise, the test agent will be maybe there, but it will be not running, so it will be not able to execute your tests. Okay, so the test agent is ready. So the next task is to actually running the test itself. This can be run with this special run functional test task. This run functional test task is basically connecting to a test agent and trying to run a set of test cases or set of tests with that test agent. For that, you need to provide the name of the machines where the test agents are located. You have to provide where the binaries of the tests are located. You remember we have deployed or we have copied our files into the C drive deployment folder. And because of our project structure, basically our tests are currently located in the C/deployment/SpecSync for mtm-demo.specs/bin/release folder. So this is why this is specified it like that. The other part of the configuration is how you are selecting those test cases that you would like to execute. In my case, right now I have selected a test plan as an option here. And basically within that, I had to select the test plan to be used. I have only one test plan, so that's easy. And I was also able to select a test suite that I would like to run the test cases from. As you can see, you can select multiple test suites as well. With that, you can quite well configure what are the set of tests that you would like to run. I also needed to provide the configuration, and basically that's all. The rest of the build is just the usual stuff. It is publishing and dropping the results. As our build seems to be configured properly, we just need to queue a new instance, and let's see how it works. I'm executing this build now on the hosted build agent, so I don't need to have any special build machine to have this running. And actually the build itself will not be executing on the virtual machine. The build will run on the hosted build agent of Visual Studio Team System. The only thing which will run on the virtual machine is the test execution of that particular test. As you can see, the build execution has been finished and the build was completed successfully. As you can see, it took about 3 minutes to run this test. So obviously, this kind of testing is better for doing larger integration tests, not for smaller unit tests that we have. Another setting that we should probably mention in the run functional test task is the distribute test by number of machines checkbox. If you are enabling this checkbox and if you have multiple virtual machines, then basically the test execution is distributed across the virtual machines, so you can basically implement some kind of parallel testing scenario with that. Currently we have only one virtual machine, so we couldn't see that in action. As our build was passing, this means that also our tests were passing, we can come to the tests section of the TFS web interface and go to the runs section. You can see the recent test runs in this list, including the test run we just completed. You can see a general overview, you can go into the individual test results, or you can even download the TRX file, which is containing all the execution details. So basically, with that, we have a nice reporting interface that can be used to see the results of our test executions on this virtual machine. And this is basically the end of our presentation. Whenever you want to run SpecFlow scenarios or on Azure virtual machines or in other testing infrastructures, it always makes sense to start with a plan. Just have a plan of the process, how you would like to build your project, how do you want to run the tests, and how you would like to collect the results. If you would like to run the SpecFlow scenarios on Azure virtual machines using the test infrastructure that we have shown, then you have to prepare the virtual machines to be able to run WinRM, and of course you have to prepare these virtual machines to be able to run your tests. You also need to synchronize your scenarios into TFS test cases. This is what you can use with SpecSync. SpecSync can also help you with the special handling of the scenario outlines, since this infrastructure currently cannot run multiple tests or these parameterized test cases. Once you have that, you need to create a build. The build should build the project. It should copy the result, the compiled result, to the virtual machines. You can use this copy to VM task. You have to deploy the test agent, which is not only deploying the test agent, but also making sure that it's running. And you have to run the selected synchronized automated test cases on the virtual machines. If you run the build and the build is successful, then you can check the test execution report on the test run report section of the TFS web interface. For other details about SpecSync, please check out the documentation, and please also check out the SpecSolutions YouTube channel for other SpecSync related videos. Thank you for watching and happy syncing!